4012 Country Living Zone. I think we're breaking new ground in the sense that I think this is the first ever Resource Management Act hearing to be undertaken by Zoom. So hopefully we're paving positive new ground. I would like to thank everybody for their willingness to participate this way. We think it's important that we press on, and we're looking forward to seeing how this goes. We've done quite a lot of background work to make sure that it works properly and that we can communicate and hear each other. So fingers crossed that all works well. In terms of the way we want to run this, it's very much the same as what we would do in a conventional hearing. The individual submitters and/or Section 42A report writers will make their presentations to us. We will ask any questions. Obviously, the public and other submitters are listening to that and can hear it, but their turn will come when it's their turn to make their presentation to us when it is their turn. So I think, unless there's any questions from anybody in terms of proceedings or processes, we'll commence. Only to say that for the record, we've noted in our minute that went out late last week that attendance via this mechanism is optional, and anybody that doesn't feel comfortable for whatever reason participating online will be able to present their submissions in due course at a regular face-to-face hearing. And I think that's been made pretty clear to everybody. So I think without further ado, we'll kick off, and we'll start with Ms. Chibnall, who's going to present the 42A report. Summary, please.
Right. So good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Morning.
This is, as Phil said, this is hearing 12, Country Living Zone. So good morning, Chair, Commissioners and submitters. My name is Susan Chibnall, and I am the 42 Reporting Officer for the Country Living Zone. I'm also the author of the rebuttal evidence in relation to the zone. I do not intend to cover my recommendations in detail. My opening statement will provide a broad overview of the zone as it was notified, namely where it applies in the district and the framework contained for the zone, the objectives of the Country Living Zone and the associated policies and rules, overview of the submissions and the main themes, a name change for the Country Living Zone, relationship with Topic 5 definitions, main changes recommended from the notified version, recommended amendments from consideration of submitted evidence, remaining areas of contention raised through evidence, rebuttal evidence and legal submissions. So firstly, the objectives, policy, rules and plan structure. I'll begin by outlining the purpose, structure and content of the Country Living Zone and identify where this zone applies in the district. The Country Living Zone is historical in nature and is in the Waikato section of the Operative District Plan since 1995. The Country Living Zone provides for low density living at specific locations in rural areas. It is generally located near a town or village, but also applies to isolated rural areas. There are no new areas of Country Living Zone in the proposed district plan when compared with the Operative District Plan. The intent and purpose of the Country Living Zone is somewhat of a transition zone between the urban zones and the rural zone. The minimum lot size of 5,000 square metres is intended to provide rural residential living opportunities that are large enough to be self-serviced in terms of water supply, wastewater and stormwater. The Country Living Zone has a number of overlays which apply to particular areas. These include the Hamilton Urban Expansion Area, which adjoins Hamilton City, the Airport Subdivision Control Boundary and Airport Noise Outer Control Boundary, which applies to areas near the Waikato Regional Airport, and Horatu Noise Acoustic Area. Subdivision is controlled in the Urban Expansion Area and the Airport Subdivision Control Boundary, whereas the other overlays are more focused on managing land use activities. Other site-specific overlays apply within the Country Living Zone, such as historic heritage and Māori sites in areas of significance, but these are the subject of later hearings. The objective and policies relating to the Country Living Zone are located in the Rural Environment chapter, Chapter 5, reflective of the closer alignment with the rural environment and the more rural character of the zone. This also reflects the relationship of the country living zone with the often adjacent rural zone. In Chapter 5, Rural Environment, there is a strategic objective at the start of the chapter that also applies to the country living zone and supports the rural environment in terms of high-class soils and the effects of subdivision. In addition, there are broad objectives and policies, such as in Section 5.2, that arguably apply to the country living zone as well as the rural zone. The rural framework is contained in Chapter 23 of the proposed Waikato District Plan. In terms of specific objectives and policies applying uniquely to the country living zone, the country living zone has one overarching objective, Objective 5.6.1, and a suite of policies to support it, policies 5.6.2 through to 18. The main focus of this objective is to ensure the character and amenity values are maintained or enhanced. The supporting policies include controls imposed on bulk and location of buildings, earthworks, and also support some of the non-residential activities to occur in the zone. The policies also seek to manage the effects of noise, signage, and reverse sensitivity. The policies for subdivision ensure the character of the zone is not eroded through various means which are set out in the policy. Chapter 23 is grouped into 4 parts as follows. Section 23.1, land use activities, which provide for a range of activities within the zone, such as residential activity, temporary events, and home occupation. Section 23.2, land use effects, which includes rules that control noise, earthworks, and signs. This section also includes rules on notable trees, hazardous substances, and significant natural areas, which are addressed in other hearings. Section 23.3, land use building, which includes rules that generally control the bulk and location of buildings and density of dwellings, such as maximum height, setbacks, and daylight admission rules. Section 23.4, subdivision, which controls lot size, shape, and form. Now, an overview of the submissions. There are 342 primary submission points that relate to the country living zone and 334 further submissions received. Of these, 95 submissions were in relation to subdivision. The submissions cover a wide range of issues, including the following main issues. Recognition of reverse sensitivity, including on neighbouring and rural productive areas and existing infrastructure. Emergency services facilities, objectives and policies and rules to support these activities and their associated structures. Crime prevention through environmental design, SEPTED. The use of SEPTED in new development. Provisions to manage the impact of homestays, inclusive of Airbnb and Book a Match. Provisions to enable childcare facilities and management of home occupation. And land use effects, in particular noise, signs, and earthworks. Land use, building setbacks, height and daylight emissions, and site coverage. In regard to subdivision, a number of submissions sought amendment to enable smaller lots below 5,000 square metres. Consideration of the prohibitive subdivision rule, which applies to Hamilton's urban expansion area, and controls on subdivision and airport subdivision control boundary in Hamilton's urban expansion area. There were not a significant number of submissions seeking amendments to the overarching objectives for the zone. Fire and Emergency New Zealand sought a new objective to support fire and emergency facilities. Submissions on the policy sought recognition on a number of matters, including non-residential activities such as childcare, water supply for firefighting, recognition of reverse sensitivity, earthworks and signs. Inclusion of SEPTED in the policies was also sought by New Zealand Police. Included in this group was a desire to change the name of the zone to align with the national planning standards. The majority of the submissions received were in relation to Chapter 23 rules. Submissions sought a range of amendments, inclusion or deletion of activities, and changes to the effects and building rules. These submissions were highly specific and sought amendments such as reduced setbacks and more relaxed daylight admission angles. There was much interest in the earthworks provision, and the management of signs and noise also attracted a reasonable number of submissions. The submissions that attracted a relatively large amount of submissions in the building and effects rules were the building setback rule, minor dwellings rule, and the building coverage rule. The submissions on the subdivision provision sought a more relaxed policy position for undersized lots, which was notified as avoiding undersized lots. This was complemented by submissions seeking a reduction in the minimum lot size, which is notified as being 5,000 square metres. Submissions challenged the minimum lot size of 5,000 square metres and sought a reduced lot size ranging from 1,000 to 4,000 square metres and everything in between. Submissions also challenged the prohibited activity status for subdivision within Hamilton's urban expansion area. A number of submissions also questioned the larger size requirement for subdivision in the airport subdivision control boundary. So summary of the recommended amendments to the notified version. Objectives and policies. The first amendment is the name change for the zone. I have recommended that the name Country Living Zone is changed to align with the national planning standards and recommend the zone be called Rural Lifestyle Zone. The concept of the Country Living Zone means different things to the people who reside in this zone. I note that Mr. Crisp in his evidence suggests the zone is more akin to the national planning standard zone, large lot residential, but I do not agree, as the intention of the zone is to align more closely with the rural environment, and the combination of standards, including minimum lot size, support a more rural character and amenity rather than urban. I have recommended including a new policy for reverse sensitivity to support the ongoing use of neighbouring productive land areas and primary production activities. This policy also supports the setback rules for various transport modes, including the rail corridor, which are intended to minimise reverse sensitivity effects. There was a policy regarding reverse sensitivity already in policy 5.6.3 subdivision within the Country Living Zone, but I have recommended this as a separate policy so it is applicable to land use as well as subdivision. I have recommended a specific policy which provides support for the rules. I have recommended inserting to enable fire and emergency service, activities and facilities and structures. I have recommended amendments to the policies regarding subdivision to make the policy position on undersized lots clearer. I have recommended minor amendments to various policies that improve the readability and clarity of the plan. So now I'll move on to Chapter 23, the rules. The recommended amendments to Chapter 23 are as follows. Inclusion of provisions for emergency service facilities and associated training and management activities to acknowledge the importance of this service to communities. Provision of education facilities to support the social infrastructure of communities. Enabling farming as an activity that can occur in the zone and sustainable use of land, especially areas with high-class soils. Enabling small-scale children facilities as these can have a functional need in supporting the community. Provisions to allow for travellers accommodation on a small scale. Recognition has also been given to the importance of the urban expansion area by incorporating new provisions that limit land use activities in this area. Increase in the permitted maximum earthworks volume to recognise the size of the lots and to be a more practical approach. Inclusion of a size limit for signs to ensure the character of the zone is maintained, and recognition of road and traffic management and railway crossings in terms of setbacks for signs. The removal of the outdoor storage policy and rule, as this is not considered to be a significant issue for this zone and the rules are not workable for property owners. An increased height allowance as a controlled activity for fire and emergency facilities. The addition of a rule to manage impervious surfaces, which has been transferred from Chapter 14, Infrastructure and Energy. Inclusion of a rule to manage setback for sensitive land uses and minimise the potential for reverse sensitivity effects. a more lenient approach to the setback to water bodies if they are insignificant in nature or a managed wetland, and consequential inclusion of a definition of managed wetland. So I'm now going to talk about subdivision rules. There was a significant interest in the subdivision provisions. I've outlined below the main changes I have recommended in response to submissions. Minor amendments to the subdivision rule that improves the readability of the rule. This includes the separation of rules into specific areas such as multi-sites of significance or subdivision of land containing historic heritage items. A change in activity status from prohibited activity for subdivision in the urban expansion area to discretionary to better represent the number of properties that this may affect and the significance of subdivision in this overlay. Additional matters of discretion for general subdivision to better manage impacts of development on infrastructure, water supply and firefighting, and reverse sensitivity. Relocation of the rule for subdivision of the National Grid corridor from Chapter 14, Infrastructure and Energy, to give this greater presence in the plan. Deletion of the subdivision rule creating reserves, as this is not necessary in this zone. The inclusion of a consistent terminology for cycleways and bridleways into the rule for subdivision of land containing mapped off-road walkways. So there are some further recommended amendments arising from submitted evidence. 19 pieces of evidence were received, including rebuttal evidence, and a legal submission filed by Mr. Peter Fuller, legal counsel for the surveying company and Buckland Group. There are 7 further amendments to my recommendation as a result of the submitter's evidence that was filed. Many of these are minor amendments that improve the readability of the plan. The use of minimise as opposed to mitigate in the recommended new policy for reverse sensitivity. I have detailed this in section 4.1 of my rebuttal and consider that it is more accurately reflects the Waikato Regional Policy Statement. Amendments to the matters of discretion for education facilities. Expert advice from Mr. Darren Humphreys that recommended accepting the Waikato District Health Board submission addressing the noise rule. A minor amendment to the building setback rule on matters of discretion managing the effect on traffic to refer to transport network safety and efficiency. Amendment to the building setback rule so they better align for managing sites adjoining the rail corridor. A proposed definition for a managed wetland when managing the setback rules for buildings. Amendments to the matters of discretion for general subdivision to focus on a water supply that is accessible for firefighting, rather than a water supply that is protected for firefighting. There is one amendment that was more significant departure from my initial Section 42A report. As a result of considering the evidence from Fire and Emergency New Zealand, I have recommended a new controlled activity for the height of emergency facilities, excluding hose drying towers. Ms. Duncan pointed out that the facilities need to have a height allowance that supports the operational and functional use of a fire station of 8 to 9 metres, and that hose drying towers are usually in order of 15 metres. I've agreed with this and subsequently recommended a controlled activity that supports this, as well as amendments to the maximum height standards for these structures. So the remaining matters of contention raised in submitted evidence. While submitter's evidence has caused me to change my recommendation on some provisions, I thought it would be helpful for the panel for me to outline the matters still in contention where I disagree with the evidence. So in relation to land use activities, Mr. Hodgson filed evidence on behalf of Horticulture New Zealand and considered that policy addressing reverse sensitivity should be to minimise or avoid to more appropriately give effect to the Waikato Regional Policy Statement. Mr. Hodgson raises a valid point, but I'm also mindful that the Regional Policy Statement predated the case law on the word avoid and the absolute nature of its interpretation. I note also that the wording of the Waikato Regional Policy Statement is to avoid or minimise, and thus I consider that a district plan policy position of minimise would still be giving effect to the Waikato Regional Policy Statement as required by Section 75(3)(c) of the RMA. Ms. Duncan, on behalf of Fire and Emergency New Zealand, sought to incorporate rules requiring water supply for firefighting. I have not been persuaded by Ms. Duncan to change my opinion on this matter. As discussed in my rebuttal report, I still am of the opinion that this is an unreasonable burden to place on a property owner. Ms McKelly, on behalf of Heritage New Zealand Pohuri-Taonga, sought amendments to the earthworks policy to address the effects on heritage and cultural values. I remain of the opinion that the objectives and policies relating to heritage in Chapter 2 Tangata Whenua and Chapter 7 Heritage are sufficient to address the concerns of Heritage New Zealand Pohuri-Taonga. Ms Gould sought additional objectives and policies for the management of commercial industrial activities in the country living zone on behalf of Hamilton City Council. I remain of the opinion that the changes sought are necessary as the policies fundamentally do not support large-scale commercial or industrial activities, which are the concerns of Hamilton City Council. Ms Running, on behalf of New Zealand Transport Agency, sought a standard for the number of heavy vehicles that can be associated with a home occupation. I have pointed out in my rebuttal that as the standard is for 15 for the whole zone, it was not reasonable to limit home occupations to 4 heavy vehicles. Ms Gould sought changes to the rules managing commercial and industrial activity on behalf of Hamilton City Council. As discussed above, I see this as unnecessary as there are some commercial and industrial activities in this zone that provide a functional support to the community, albeit at a scale appropriate for the purpose of the zone. Mr Lester, on behalf of Blue Wallace Surveyors, sought amendments to allow for earthworks for access ways as a permitted activity. I have concerns about allowing a permitted activity for an unknown amount of earthworks. Since my rebuttal, I have received the below advice from Council's Development Engineer, Mr David Bastian. And he says, there are circumstances when access to a building platform may be along an access lead for a rear lot, and to not have a rule framework in place could result in significant earthworks, both in volume and depth, or consequential effects on adjoining landowners. Mr Bastian also pointed out that the threshold for earthworks under the Waikato Regional Plan are significantly higher than in the country living zone and should only be considered as appropriate for large-scale rural land on a regional scale. Country living zone allows for lots down to 5,000 square metres, and unregulated earthworks could significantly affect the amenity of an area both during the activity and in relation to any change in landform. Mr Lester also sought amendment to allow for earthworks near a boundary to be 0.5 metre rather than the proposed 1.5 metres. Mr Bastian's advice was, I understand the argument being made here and I don't want a consent to be required unnecessarily. The only thing I would need to consider where earthworks are undertaken in a wall built less than 1.5 metres high, which does not trigger any consent. A basic rule of thumb is applying a 45-degree incline from the base of the wall up to the natural ground to assess what level of surcharge is applied on a slope or wall. This could mean a wall that is up to 1.5 metres high wouldn't trigger a building or land use consent, but may influence the use of the land up to 1 metre inside the neighbouring property if the desired 0.5 metre setback is accepted. Without a proper assessment, the true long-term effects to the neighbour couldn't be established. My recommendation is to retain the minimum earthwork setback as 1.5 to capture risk of earthworks or walls being built that could compromise the use of adjoining land. I am mindful, this is me now, I am mindful of the advice of Mr Bastian, and therefore this remains a matter of contention. Heritage New Zealand sought amendments to the signage rules. I'm not persuaded by the evidence provided and believe the signage rules are appropriate without detracting from the heritage and cultural values. I'll now discuss the subdivision. Ms Duncan, on behalf of Fire and Emergency New Zealand, sought that the assessment criteria for general subdivision be explicit about requiring a water supply for firefighting purposes. I remain concerned that it implies that unrealistic expectation of protecting a water source, such as water tanks, that are only accessible for firefighting purposes, and instead have recommended that the focus be on accessibility of water supply for firefighting purposes, rather than a protected water supply for firefighting. Mr Lester, on behalf of Blue Wallace Surveyors Limited, sought a softening of the subdivision policy position from avoid to discouraging. Given Council's experience with soft policy position on smaller lots, the operative country living zone, I am not persuaded by Mr. Lester's evidence. I consider the use of a void is important in order to provide clear direction, particularly when consent planners are assessing undersized and suboptimal subdivision applications. Ms. Palmer, on behalf of Bow Rock Properties, disagrees with avoiding undersized lots and recommends an avoid policy position with an additional clause allowing undersized lots if it can be demonstrated that productive capacity is retained. Ms. Palmer recommends providing flexibility in subdivision design, lot size, if an applicant can demonstrate that productive capacity of land can be retained. I believe this could create an unintended loophole for undersized lots where there may be no intention of utilising the land for productive use. Mr. Crisp filed evidence seeking to reduce the lot size and contending that the country living zone is more akin to a large lot residential zone. I am not persuaded by either argument. I believe that allowing for lots as small as 3,000 square metres would erode the character of the country living zone and further exacerbate reverse sensitivity effects. Mr. Hartley prepared evidence for the surveying company and supported an average lot size regime. As discussed above, I have concerns that an average lot size regime would create a situation where it was difficult to decline a subdivision with undersized lots. As discussed above, there is also the risk that the character of the zone would be eroded and would become highly similar to the village zone, which has a deliberately different purpose and character. Ms. Colt, on behalf of Hamilton City Council, sought retaining the notified prohibitive rule for subdivision in Hamilton's urban expansion area. I am not persuaded by Ms. Galt's evidence. I do not believe a minimum lot size of 5,000 square metres would compromise future urbanisation, particularly given the small number of lots that could realistically be generated. Mr. Howarth prepared evidence addressing the limitations on subdivision within the airport subdivision control boundary and considered this approach to be unreasonable given the current and future operation of the Waikato Regional Airport. As discussed in my rebuttal report, the Waikato Regional Airport is deemed regionally significant infrastructure as defined in the Waikato Regional Policy Statement. In addition, there are a number of directives in the Waikato Regional Policy Statement to minimise or avoid reverse sensitivity. As such, it is important to minimise reverse sensitivity effects that can arise from subdivision and limit the number of additional lots and therefore residents living in the area affected by elevated aircraft noise. This matter was also addressed by Ms. Drew in her rebuttal evidence, which supported my recommendation. However, Ms. Drew's report was contingent upon additions to policy 5.6.3 to refer to regional significant infrastructure, which I do not agree with. Mr. Barrett, on behalf of Mr. Coppins and Mr. Hodgins, also dispute the limitations on subdivision in the airport subdivision control boundary. He suggested that no complaints covenants be introduced via land encumbrances on subdivisions. I believe that limiting subdivision in the area is a more efficient and effective approach. Ms. Whitney, on behalf of Transpower New Zealand, opposed my recommendation to relocate the subdivision rule applying to the National Grid Corridor into the Zone chapter rather than remaining in Chapter 14, Infrastructure and Energy. Whether the rule is in Chapter 14 or located in the zone, either approach delivers the desired outcome. However, I consider that in the meantime, to ensure the rule is not overlooked, it is transferred to each zone chapter. Ms. McCallie, on behalf of Heritage New Zealand Poheri Taonga, raised concerns that the new subdivision provisions do not fully integrate heritage items. There is no need for heritage items to be included in the new subdivision rule, as it is already addressed in the existing rule. Mr. Lester, on behalf of Blue Wallace Surveyors, sought to reduce the size of the building platform to be identified on subdivision applications. I have not agreed with Mr. Lester in this regard and consider requiring a larger platform is appropriate to ensure the landowner can, as a permitted activity, have options as to locating buildings on the property. So, in conclusion, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank the experts and submitters who have provided well thought out thorough and reasoned evidence. I look forward to further evidence presented by the submitters over the course of the hearing and welcome any questions that the panel may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Chibnall. Let's just see if there's any questions from the panel. Perhaps we can start with you, Ms. Te Aho, please.
Kia ora, Susan. Thank you for your report and your summary. I'm just going to focus in on one issue that from your Section 42A report and in your summary this morning, and it relates to the subdivision rules and the deletion of the provisions for creating reserves, and also your response to the submissions from Pouhere Taonga, and saying that the issues that were raised in that submission were dealt with under the Tangata Whenua chapter. And I've just had a look back at the Tangata Whenua chapter to see whether the provisions that were recommended there were protective enough of heritage sites that might be uncovered when subdivision takes place. And to me, I can understand and appreciate the concerns that Pouhere Taonga have. And the example that I'll give is in the Waipa district area during a subdivision around Pukekura and the creation of the Whare Marama Reserve. So when the ground was uncovered to start the subdivision, a very unique archaeological find was made. The initial response of the developer was to take a photo of it so that that photograph could be preserved, but after some discussions with the council and the developer, in short, we created the Whare Marama Reserve, which is, and you can Google that and find out what that's about. It's a very unique type of a settlement, and so that's abuts the road, and the names were changed of the roads, etc. We're really proud of the fact that that reserve has been created to preserve that very unique piece of heritage. It's not just Māori heritage, it's New Zealand heritage. And so the things that Pouhere Taonga were asking for in the Tangata Whenua chapter, which was not to destroy these sites, and then again in the country living area, which was, I think the provision was to allow the creation of reserves and have a roadway beside it to enable access. And yet you see that the better response is just to delete the possibility of creating reserves. So can you just explain how we are to protect these really important heritage sites if you're going to delete and not give effect to the submissions that Pouhere Taonga are seeking?
I think I see two aspects to it. My reasoning for deleting the requirement for a reserve was actually based around council requiring a land through a subdivision for a reserve. On the country living zone, I didn't see that was necessary because of the size of the sites. And would you have a neighbourhood park, for want of a better word, in the country living zone? And I thought probably not really. But I can see your point about a reserve for maybe if a site was significant. But I believe that the rules that manage an unknown archaeological site there are no rules that manage a site that gets uncovered accidentally, but there are protocols in the Heritage Act, I believe, that cover those accidental findings. Now, I think that I still don't believe that it would stop a reserve being created. It would just be a matter of who owned a section, if you like, in a subdivision that then became council's ownership. I think if that would be, so it might not necessarily be a reserve per se. I think I'm trying to get a difference between creating a reserve for a neighbourhood park as opposed to creating a reserve to protect an archaeological site.
I guess the example that I raise is that if the Whare Marama was kind of, just to put it really I don't know, crudely, it's kind of like the maternity area prior to colonisation, prior to British settlement. And so what's going to occur there is the council is going to work with developers and iwi to establish a playground type park where children can go, because that was the purpose, and preserve the old house that's in the site and the particular archaeological features, and enhance them. So that there was a solution that was reached, and I'm a bit concerned that if we take out the provision that allows for such a solution, you know, that's not going to be, it's going to be a barrier to be, you know, for those unique sites to be shown and protected. It's not a wāhi tapu per se, it's not a sacred site, but it's a really important aspect of our heritage, which is an unusual find, and the best solution was to create a reserve. Now, if that provision is taken out altogether, just completely, I mean, what would be the cost or the disadvantage of just leaving that provision in there to allow it to occur if a find? Because the Waikato is just rich with these sites.
Yes, it is, yeah. Yes, no, I see your point, and I think you're right. There probably would not be any issue in leaving the rule in there, but I don't think also that I think that if the rule framework could be such that in the event of such a site occurred, that a reserve could be created, rather than there being a expectation that everybody would be expected to supply a reserve if they did a subdivision and there was no site uncovered. Because I think that originally how the rule was written meant that even if someone did a 2-lot subdivision, there'd be a requirement for council to have a reserve. And I didn't think that that was reasonable, especially in the country living zone. But I do see your point about if in the event there is a site such as what you're talking about discovered, that it would be beneficial to the district to have that protected as a reserve somehow. So yes, I think it would be good to come up with a framework that spoke to that situation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Fulton?
Yeah, thanks, Phil. Just good morning. Just want clarification about the earthworks. When we talk about earthworks, you talk about the driveways and the accesses to the building sites and the building site itself. Is that all part of earthworks, the house foundation, for instance?
The issue is that the building platform has a permitted activity status to build the building platform. And it's always been that the access way was not included in that, because often in subdivisions, the building platforms, they're not constructed, nor are the entranceways or the accessways. They're not constructed, and it gives flexibility for a landowner maybe to decide where they might put that building platform. But there's a permitted activity for the building platform, but my experience, especially as an ex-monitoring officer, that sometimes those access ways can generate significant earthwork to get to the building platform, depending on where it is located. And so they are separated.
Okay, that's fine. I just want clarity on that. Thanks.
Mr. Cooney.
I thank you. Firstly, thank you very much for the way you've set out the information in your reports. I think you've done a good job setting it out so clearly. The issues that we have to discuss, but certainly you've set it out very well. So thank you. Just on the Hamilton expansion area, under the operative plan, what were the controls over subdivision in that area?
I'll just bring up the operative rules. So the operative rules, they were in the, I think there are some in the country living zones. Just loading. Actually, there don't seem to be, I can't see any in the country living zone, so it's just taking a little while to. Don't seem to be, I can't see any operative rules in the country living zone chapter for the urban expansion area. Oh, excuse me, this is.
Okay. But generally, in the other zones, do you know what just generally they were?
I think that they were prohibited. I'm just going to bring up the country living zone and the rural zone. Just taking a little while to right, so there are some in there are some rules in the rural zone which apply to the urban expansion area, and they are prohibitive rules.
Okay.
Prohibited activities.
So no subdivision.
In subdivision, they relate. Yes, there are subdivision rule, prohibited subdivision rules in the rural zone.
Yeah. And so the notified plan seeks to continue that on for the country living zone.
Prohibitive rule for
Yeah.
subdivision? No,
Yeah.
we are looking at a discretionary activity.
No. What was notified?
Oh, what was notified?
Yeah.
What was notified was prohibitive. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and you're recommending go down to discretionary.
Yes.
Yeah.
Can I just add to this, the operative district plan, it doesn't distinguish subdivision from in the urban expansion area from the general country living zone. And so that means that under the operative plan, subdivision in the urban expansion area would be classified as a controlled activity. So this going from controlled in the operative to prohibited in the proposed is quite a big jump.
Yeah. Yeah. And so you're bringing it back down to what the status was under the operative district plan, Ms. Chibnall.
Oh, sorry, I just got a little something.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it looks like you're trying to at having the status as discretionary.
Yes.
You're just following what was under the, according to Caroline, what was in the operative plan.
Yes, and I think it's also reflective of what the potential yield could be anyway. It's quite low.
It's a small area. Yeah.
It's a small area, yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Just Hamilton City are concerned about Tamahere and have said that it's going to compromise urban development if we have any lesser lot sizes there, or if it's have they made any moves? They've never sought to bring this in as a Hamilton expansion area.
So
it's never been identified as such.
the area for the urban expansion area. Sorry, I don't quite understand.
The Tamahere has been sort of, the evidence from Hamilton City has been indicating that, well, this is pretty near to us, when it comes over into the urban area, all this development that is taking place there will compromise any future urban development there. But they haven't sought to bring that in as an urban expansion area, is that right?
No, at the moment the urban expansion area, to best my knowledge, is north of Horatu, just north of Horatu, or just across the river from Horatu in that area there.
Just a different subject, the fire and emergency and what they were seeking they've been appearing in front of us on a number of other hearings, leaving aside the water supply issue. Have you checked to see, you know, whether there's consistency in what you are recommending and what was recommended in the other reports? Have you checked that?
Other reports being, yes,
Section 42A reports.
Yes, no, and I took on board that. I think that initially they were after from memory, a discretionary activity. And I considered that after that in that hearing that it's more appropriate that they are a controlled activity, because they are an important service to the community. And if they can strategically locate where they can, that they'll be in a much better position to support any unfortunate fires.
Just going back to your discussion about reserves, what's that rule? What's the reserve rule? Can you give me the reference to it?
23.4.9.
23.4.9. Okay. So how does your reserve acquisition work? Do you take it through development contribution regime, or how do you know generally how that works on subdivision?
Not particularly, but I know that the rule 23.4.9, I think that if I look at the rule here, but it is taken by subdivision. So, and I'd have to seek advice on the development contribution.
No, don't at the moment. No, I know generally how that stuff works.
Yeah.
So yeah, look, I'll check that out on my end, but I don't think I've got any further questions. One of your noise rule in 23.2.1, I think it is. That's where you took some advice, and you've come back and sort of amended the noise rule. When I read that, the way it's been rewritten, it just seemed a bit clumsy. Hang on, I'm just trying to find it, but what the amendments, what you proposed in that rule, it doesn't actually refer to where the noise is to be measured from. Do you want to just go and check that again? Because it should be a reasonably standardized condition. The numbers may be different in different zones, but the wording should be a sort of almost standardized throughout the plan. So can you just check that?
I can certainly do that, and I certainly do not propose to be a noise expert, and did rely on our noise expert to give me advice on this.
Yeah. But anyhow, we won't go into detail. I'm not talking about the technical. I'm just talking about the wording of it.
The wording of it. Okay.
And it should be reasonably consistent with the other wording, other provisions for noise in the other zones. So just check that. Other than that, I don't think I have any other questions. It looks like one of the main issues anyhow is the minimum lot size, isn't it?
Yes.
That seems to be where the main debate focuses here.
Yes, it is. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thanks for that. We'll come back to you later. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Just a couple from me, Ms. Chibnall. Is it the intention that all the objectives and policies in Chapter 5 relate to the country living zone, or only those in Chapter 5 6.6, which is the specific country living zone provision?
Yeah, good question. I think that arguably, yes, they do, because the country living zone is surrounded by the rural environment and productive rural land. And I think that there is that opportunity, like I've alluded to in my report, that the country living zone can be used productively on a small scale. It doesn't have to support the national economy, but I do. So to me, those objectives and policies in Chapter 5 could arguably apply to the country living zone.
I think that's my question is, I don't think we want to be in a situation later on of having a debate, or not we won't be having it, but other people having a debate about whether they arguably do or don't apply. And I suppose I'm not sure if it's a question or a suggestion, but it would seem to me if the intention is for particular policies to apply or not apply, would you agree that the plan needs to be explicit in relation to that?
Yes, yeah, I would agree with that. And,
Okay.
And it
So
could be
maybe you can just give some. I think it's inevitable in these hearings that there's a little bit of follow-up work required, and I suspect that might be one of them, just in terms of tidying up that together with some of the matters that you've already been asked about. But we'll clarify that at the end. Second question relates to this policy direction and about the use of the word avoid. And you've made mention in your report about what king salmon means and the implications of avoid. How have you linked the activity status in the rules with the provision to avoid in the policy? And I guess my particular query would be, it's one thing to say you've got a policy to avoid something, but then having a non-complying activity consent classification, I would have thought that anything that proposes to not avoid those things would be in direct opposition to the policy. So a non-complying activity application arguably could never be granted. And if that is the case, why wouldn't you retain prohibited activity status?
Okay.
I'm not sure if I've explained that very clearly. I mean,
So
avoid. We know that avoid means avoid.
Yes.
And that means you can't do it. You can undertake an activity as a non-complying activity if it passes the not contrary to objectives and policies. And the case law is pretty clear that those directive policies like avoid, are elevated to very high status. So that being the case, how would a non-complying activity consent ever get granted on the basis that it seems to me incongruous or impossible that it would ever be not contrary to that objective?
Well, we've only got one overarching objective to the country living zone, which does, and the policies underneath, the only avoid is the time avoiders are used is in the subdivision policy. To
Yeah, understood.
So, and I guess that the rest of them are, I guess the non-complying to me means that we don't really want it, but if you can show that that it's not going to be an awful situation, and you can, there might be a situation where it will be acceptable to have a non-complying activity.
But isn't that sidestepping the policy? Because I don't think the policy has the sidestepping provision in it, does it? It's absolute.
So the policy for the country living zone, for any of the policies, so none of our policies use avoid apart from the subdivision.
No, well, that's my point. Why would it not be a prohibited activity? Because you have got the void in that without qualification, as I read it. And if that's the case, there's no provision in the policy for the sidestep that you're talking about. So I don't think you can have a rule that sidesteps the policy unless the policy allows you to sidestep it, because it's absolute.
Right, so
I guess that's my query.
so you'd be suggesting a lesser activity status in the rule cascade instead?
Well, I would have thought that you've either got to say avoid unless, in which case you could have non-complying. And if you say the policy is black and white and says you must avoid doing something, that would seem to me that leads to prohibition.
Right, yes, I'd agree with that.
So I just wonder whether there's a slight disconnect between the policy and the rule.
Okay.
If you disagree with that, please say. Don't. I mean, I'm putting the question to you. If you say no, the policy says something different from that, then please tell me.
I'm not sure that I quite understand that, Carolyn.
Well, it says subdivision within the rural. This is in your rebuttal version, 5.6.3. Rural lifestyle zone ensures that the creation of undersized lots is avoided. Full stop.
Okay.
That would suggest to me that that's a prohibited activity, unless you said the creation of undersized lots is avoided unless applies. Then you could say it's non-complying. It's non-complying. There's a policy direction saying we don't want it. There's an exemption allowed to contemplate it with whatever height of bar that goes with that. But as it stands, the creation of undersized lots is avoided seems to me to be directive towards prohibition as drafted. And I'm wondering whether you agree with that.
Okay.
And Ms. Rapp might have a view on that as well.
Yeah, I would agree, because when it was notified, don't forget it did have that that escape clause, for want of a better word. So you had a non-complying activity status. This is just for general subdivision, undersized lots. You had a non-complying activity status coupled with an avoid policy that did have that escape clause.
Where character and amenity are compromised.
Agreed, yes. So with carving that off and making an absolute policy of avoid, yes, especially when coupled with that non-complying activity status, it does have the effect of a prohibited. It just isn't, but it could be if you were of a mind to be highly directive and consistent with where you sat on your policy, and then where that came through into an activity status. Yes, you could have that as prohibited.
Okay, no, that's fine. Thank you. Just query in terms of, and I'm not even sure that the submission's on this point, but it's just, if we go back to section 5.6 of the plan, the rural lifestyle zone, and you've said that there's only a single objective for that, and I get that. But the objective says that subdivision use and development in the country living zone maintains or enhances the character and amenity values of the zone. You've sort of got, I mean, given that that's the high level objective, you've got to drill down into a lot of detail through the rest of the plan to figure out what the point of the zone is at all, if you see what I mean. And I'm wondering whether it would make planning sense, and I'm not sure if there's a submission on this point or not, that actually spells out what the general purpose of the country living zone is. You know, to say that the country living zone has been established in order to provide, you know, lifestyle opportunities on, I don't know, you know, large scale lots, not designed to be, you know, to duplicate village zones or something like that. And this may apply through the plan as a whole. We've had sort of conversations with other Section 42A writers on this. Do you think the plan would benefit from some sort of explanatory text about what the various zones actually mean, what their purpose is?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. And I think in the operative plan, you'll see that there's an introduction to each chapter. And I actually thought that was a very useful thing to have in a plan. So you could see right up front what was the intention of the zone, what was expected to happen there, and you know, the activities that you could expect to see. And yes, I agree. I think it would be helpful they had some
Okay.
an introduction to a chapter.
I know that that approach is exactly what's in the National Planning Standards at the start of, how you've got your objectives and policies and your rules for each zone is in a chapter. At the start, there is almost an explanatory, introductory piece. It has no weight, but it could set the vision, I guess, for that zone.
Yep. I suppose it could be a strategic objective in the plan, though, to say to create a hierarchy of zones in the rural environment to achieve the following, and address it that way, perhaps.
That would actually be really useful, because I think it would make it perfectly clear as a provision rather than just
An introduction.
Yeah,
that doesn't, as Ms. Chibnall says, doesn't have much weight.
correct.
Maybe that's something that we can consider when we come to the integration of things. But if in the interim you can give some thought to how that might work, I think that would be helpful.
It may not be given weight, but it does explain the context in which the objectives and policies are to be considered, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it does. I think that's right.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that's a good point, Mr. Chair, because I was sort of looking around before for the purpose, and throughout the plan, there's no sort of real purpose to explain the different zones at all.
Just, I've got two minor points to follow. In terms of the subdivision issue in relation to reserves, I mean, there's sort of two aspects to it as I would see it. The first one would be to say, does the council have a policy that says every time there's a subdivision, we take, X amount of land to create into reserves? And I don't think that's necessarily the scenario that Ms. Tiapo was referring to. But the second one would be to say, what would happen if there was a subdivision application made and part of the area concerned had very high values of one sort or another? And she used the example of a culturally important area. It could apply to a wahi tapu, it might apply to an ecological area. There's a number of things that could say, actually subdividing this off and putting a house on it is not a good idea because of the values that would be destroyed. And then you've got the mechanism to say, well, we can create a reserve to protect it. But if we back the truck up and say, if there was a subdivision application involving a particularly sensitive piece of land, in part, do the subdivision rules allow that area to be excised from the application, or the application refused on the grounds of the values that would be compromised?
No, I don't. No, I don't think that the general subdivision rules would not allow. I'm understanding your question correctly. There would be no requirement for that developer to give us that reserve.
No, I'm not so much relating to it to a reserve. I mean, a reserve is one mechanism to protect the values. If we put reserves to one side and look at the issue and at its core and say, person X has applied for a subdivision consent to create 4 lots on this particular block of land. One of those lots contains significant heritage values, or it's a significant ecological area, or it has some other identified value. Does the subdivision consent allow for that area to be protected in some way? Do the activity status and or the matters of discretion, assessment criteria, etc., do they allow for them to be protected?
I can probably answer this one, and I draw your attention to Rule 2346, which is subdivision of land containing heritage items, as well as 2346A, which is subdivision of land containing archaeological sites, Maori sites of significance, and Maori areas of significance. So they kind of go down a different path from the general subdivision. And as you'll see, you've got matters of discretion on things like effects on the heritage values, context and setting of the heritage items, and the extent to which the relationship of the heritage item with its setting is maintained. And that is an restricted discretionary activity where it's contained wholly within one lot. And if it gets split, it cascades to a non-complying activity for heritage items and a discretionary activity in the case of archaeological sites, Māori sites in areas of significance.
So on that basis, you don't necessarily need the reserves provision. You could still create a reserve subsequent to a decision being made on the subdivision application. But as I understand what you've said and what the rule says, that the more fundamental issue that says if there was one of the sites of the sort that Ms. Te Aho has referred to, there are protection mechanisms in the plan already that would prevent it being subdivided and have a house placed on it.
Yes.
And then it would be a matter of saying, well, now that that's been done, what's the best way to actually protect it formally going forward? So it may not necessarily, at least to my mind, it may not necessarily lead itself to a reinstatement of that reserve provision.
Right.
Because I think that's achieving a subtly different purpose.
Yeah.
The purpose of the reserves rule is to be able to say the council will require you to vest part of your subdivision for reserve purposes, parks or something else. And I take your point, that's not the intention of the country living zone, because because there is plenty of open space. It doesn't mean that you need a pocket park like you need if it was in town. But the more fundamental issue, I think, from the panel's point of view, would be to say, if there is an area that's proposed to be subdivided that has special value, the consent process to authorise that subdivision has the ability to turn it down in part or in whole because of the presence of those special features. Is my understanding of that correct?
I think so, because the other thing that you could potentially get out of the subdivision rules and combined with the earthworks rules, that if there is I guess we're talking about an unknown area being discovered.
Exactly. That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, and I guess that through, when you look at the subdivision rules, that that developer could offer up that some sort of protection, whether it be a covenant around that area, it would still remain in private ownership and not go to council, but you could certainly put some sort of covenant around it.
That's probably something that we can discuss as a panel offline. But I just wanted to understand what your general view would be. I suppose the point though is that the matters that the rules that Ms. Raps referred to are all relating to scheduled areas. So there's already been an assessment done that says there's a heritage site there. That begs the question, I suppose, of what happens if there's something present but no one knows about it. And it's, yes. I don't know, would it be the intention of these provisions that before you could do any subdivision that you needed some sort of archaeological or ecological assessment made of the land? Is that because if you didn't have that, that's what you'd have to do, I would have thought. I don't know whether that's what you envisage or not.
No, and I guess that if it's you're right, it's subdivision of land containing a heritage item, so that presumably means it's already been assessed.
Well, it says listed in schedule 30.1, so it's it's already been predetermined what they are.
And those heritage items actually in that schedule 30.1 tend to be more of the built heritage.
Okay. Well, we'll come back to that. I've asked the question, and I think you've provided the answer. I think the panel might have to just figure out what that means.
Well, just before you go, Mr. Chair, on that point, I think the issue that does come up is when these areas of value are discovered. They're unknown, but they're discovered. And I just see that our discretion under general subdivision is is restricted to the following matters: adverse effects on amenity values, then effects on the airport. I wonder whether some consideration should be given to a wording in there that does allow a reference to special or areas of value that are discovered. It's just a question of framing the proper wording as a discretion.
Yeah, okay, no, that's helpful. Very, very finally, and I don't know whether I should ask it as a question or as a request. One thing that would be helpful, I think, for the panel, or at least for me, would be if it was possible to prepare a fairly high-level table that compares activity status of the key fundamental activities that are proposed in the proposed plan versus those that apply currently, so that we can see where there's been a softening, where there's been a hardening. I think if we were to digest the report, I mean, there's a huge amount of information here, we could probably figure it out, but it would take an awfully long time. And I think it would be helpful to be able to create a list that says a list of activities in one column, activity status in the operative plan in the middle column, activity status in the proposed plan in the final column. Then we can just get a sense of where things have been changing, and that might help our contextualization of what submitters are asking as well. Would that be difficult to do?
I don't suppose, no. I could certainly give that some thought.
It would be under the different zones. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Well, I think in relation, I think it might apply more generally, but I think in relation to this hearing, it would be helpful to, particularly around Tamahiri, and it doesn't need to be, drilling down into, minute detail. It's just the big picture stuff. What are the lot sizes? What are the setbacks? What's prohibited and what's not? Those sorts of things. Excuse me. But maybe we'll come back to that. Just have a think about that during the course of the day, and we'll talk about that again when we come to the end.
Okay.
And I'd just like to reiterate what Mr. Cooney has said. I think it's been very helpful, the way that you've set out your report, the way that you've analysed the submissions, the way that you've prepared your rebuttal, the way that you've prepared your summary. It's been very helpful, and we're very grateful for it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Right, Ms. Galt, for Hamilton City, just before you actually start, you've prepared a summary statement, which we're grateful for. The technology allows us to have that shared on our screens. So we'll ask Ms. Kelly if she could load that up. So that I think that possibly means that we won't actually be able to see you talk, although we may be able to if we've got split screens on our computers. But I think it might be preferable to see the presentation and we can hear you talk to it. And then when you've done that, we can come back and ask you any questions on it. We can do that more face to face. Does that find favour with you, Ms. Gold?
Apologies, sorry, just getting the microphone working. Yes, no, that's fine. I'll proceed as you've outlined.
Okay. All right, well, welcome. Thank you for providing your evidence. Thank you for your summary. And we'll pass it over to you to tell us what you want to tell us.
All right. Thank you, Chair and hearing panel. My name is Laura Galt and I'm presenting my evidence on behalf of Hamilton City Council for this hearing 12 Country Living Zone. I'll take my qualifications experience as read.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
So Hamilton City made 3 submissions to the Country Living Zone provisions and multiple further submissions, and they can be grouped into these 3 main headings. commercial activities in the country living zone, prohibited subdivision in the urban expansion area, and minimum lot size in the country living zone, so the general subdivision rules for country living zone. As you can see on the presentation, those are the submissions that we made in relation to the commercial activities in the country living zone. I'm not sure how I switch slides, or if that's Sandra who's going to.
I think Ms. Kelly can do that for you. There we go.
Okay. Oh, thank you very much. So the HCC submission to Rule 23.1.2 D3 was to seek to maintain the primacy of the existing commercial areas by ensuring that the commercial activities are located in appropriate business zones. Allowing for commercial activities in the country living zone should it be limited to a scale that is providing for the day-to-day needs of the community. Ms. Chibnall considers that the notified suite of policies and rules will ensure large-scale commercial activities do not locate in the country living zone. While the HCC submission supported the intent of Policy 568, non-residential uses, we believe that the current wording of functional need is broad and open to interpretation. I still believe that the country living zone objectives and policies should be strengthened further by referencing the policies 452, 453 and 454 in the business town centre zone and business zone to ensure that commercial activities are also considered against these objectives and policies and are not contrary to them, include as well as meeting the country living zone objectives and policies. Thank you. The other main submission point we made was to the prohibited subdivision in the UEA, so the urban expansion area. The section 42A author, so Ms. Chibnall, recommends reducing the activity status to discretionary from the notified prohibited activity status. I still disagree that the 15 lots that 15 lots is small and does not significantly affect future urbanisation. While this is a small number that needs to be considered alongside the already existing fragmentation of the area, and allowing another 15 lots to be subdivided will still exacerbate the existing problem. I just want to note here the Northridge example that I provided in my evidence was not to determine what plan it was approved under, excuse me, but to demonstrate what happens when a rural residential development is undertaken when the final outcome is urban densities. The prohibited activity status provides a critical statutory means for achieving the outcome of the strategic agreement, which was attached as Appendix 1 to my evidence. Comprehensive planning analysis of the UEA needs to be undertaken and to understand the area as a whole, including infrastructure provision, in a coordinated manner and informed by the wider strategic planning which is currently underway. It includes the Hamilton to Auckland work and the Metro Spatial Plan. Providing the prohibited activity status now gives Hamilton City the best means of achieving the long-term outcome of urbanisation. It's in accordance with Section 7B of the RMA and recognises and gives effects to the Waikato Regional Policy Statement, in particular the planning approach. I also want to make mention in regards to the use of a void. Ms. Chibnall considers that the policy 5.5.2 is notified as appropriate, which refers to managing subdivision use and development, whereas HCC's submission to amend the policy to avoid was recommended to be supported in hearing 3 by Mr. Matheson. I accept and understand the hearing panel is not making interim decisions, and the matter of this policy will be addressed again in the rural zone hearing. However, Hamilton City still believes that and seeks that the word avoid is retained in policy 5.5.2 as in our original submission. The reasoning being is the same resource management issues for protecting the land resource from subdivision in the rural zone apply equally to the country living zone. A consistent approach of prohibited subdivision and the use of avoid in policy 5.5.2 is required regardless of the underlying zoning. Ms. Chimble in her evidence states that a theoretical subdivision layout will address how a subdivision will not compromise future urban development, and she reiterates this in her rebuttal. I agree an individual lot could be subdivided to 5,000 square metres as the rules provide, and could easily show how across those new lots it could be subdivided further to an urban size lots in the future. The argument and the problem for Hamilton City is that this type of theoretical layout is done in isolation to surrounding properties and results in a piecemeal development and does not take into account the wider strategic context for the UEA. It's also noted that providing a theoretical layout is not a requirement of the district plan is notified, and is exactly that, and does not mean it will reflect the future reality. Finally, allowing a discretionary activity status for subdivision when land use activities are non-complying shows a disconnect of the management of the land resource when the policy 5.5.2 includes land use and subdivision together, as they create the same land fragmentation effects that we are trying to avoid. Moving on to country living zone, the minimum lot size. So the notified and recommended 5,000 square metre lots for general subdivision and country living zone. So this doesn't relate to the UEA at all, but the rest of the country living zone. HCC supports retaining the minimum lot size of 5,000 square metres and supports the retention and use of a void in the policy to ensure undersized lots are not created. A reduction of the minimum lot size will increase the number of lots and the capacity of the country living zone. The increased densities in the country living zone within Hamilton's area of interest will impact infrastructure and detract from identified growth areas in the Waikato Regional Policy Statement. Similarly, allowing reduced lot size based on proximity to towns or villages will result in an ad hoc and unplanned growth, which is contrary to the Regional Policy Statement and future-proof.
That's it.
Apologies, I put my... So in conclusion, the subdivision should be prohibited in the UEA and, in summary, Hamilton City seeks the strengthening of the objectives and policies related to commercial activities in the country living zone, retain the prohibited activity status for subdivision in the UEA and the use of the word avoid in policy 5.5.2, and retain the minimum lot size of 5,000 square metres in the country living zone. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions now.
If we could just put the video back on as opposed to the thing, that would be good. Thank you very much. Let's just see if there's any questions for you. Mr. Fulton?
Yeah, thanks. Just a question I have on the urban expansion area, and just from what I read in the report, we're talking about, I think was available to be another 15 or whatever could be created. And when I saw the maps, that they're all on River Road north of K Road, and I think they're all in an area between the or practically all in an area between the road and the river of the Hamilton Road, River Road North. So it's a one particular area that we're talking about. It's not generalised across the whole of the district. It's really only one area which is pretty well compromised anyway, and I don't think could be urbanised anyway in that particular area. That's a view that I got from the report. Are you able to agree that that was a particular one area where they are?
Yes, so it does apply to the one area, and it is a strip down that area referred to as HT2, I believe. Yes, the remainder of that urban expansion area is zoned rural.
Yeah, so they're on the western side of that H2 area. And
yes.
they're all, and just knowing the geography of that, which is riverbank effectively, it would be hardly ever urbanised anyway at any stage.
Potentially, yes.
But there's nowhere else in the district that it affects. So we're talking about one particular area.
Yes, we are.
Okay, I'm agreeing with that. Thank you. Thanks.
Mr. Yahoo.
No questions from me. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Cooney?
Just on your, you want the non-residential activities, namely commercial or industrial activities, policies in the country living zone to be beefed up. Why do you see that when there's a clear policy that says that limit the establishment of commercial industrial activities within the country living zone unless they have a functional need to locate within the country living zone? And the intention for that is really, that's from what the Section 42 author said, was to allow a cafe or small dairy or something like that to service the area. So why do you see a need to beef those up?
Our concern is with the term functional need. We consider that it's quite broad and it could be interpreted in different ways. We have no objection to allowing the small scale day-to-day commercial activities that would provide those cafes or dairy for those country living zones, but we just don't want to see any large scale development happening there. And we feel that by referencing the business zone objectives and policies, these clearly articulate that these large scale activities should happen in the commercial business zones. So it's just that further strengthening of the policy to make sure that you don't end up with those large scale, for example, a supermarket trying to establish in the country living zone.
Okay. Yes. Look. Thank you very much for your submission. I've got no further comments.
I've just got one, and it's to do with. I mean, I think the thrust of your submission is you want to protect, if you like, protect in inverted commas, the Hamilton sort of key centre type concept of saying, you know, regionally the main commercial / retail part of the region is Hamilton. And that's got two bits, I guess, the CBD and the base. Last time I was staying in Hamilton, you know, which is not that long before the lockdown, the CBD's looking pretty sorry in parts. You know, it looks like it's, you know, and it's in need of revitalisation, let's put it that way. I mean, one of the things to protect the CBD, I suppose, is to ensure that you don't get this pepper potting of things that detract from it. And obviously the base has been pretty fundamental in that shift. But what's the City Council doing in general terms to revitalise the CBD by its own initiatives as opposed to those that we might impose, you know, preventing slippage of that out into the district?
I'm not 100% sure on details, but I understand there is some work being undertaken for the central cities at the moment. And I imagine that that would be a consideration of that work. I understand that it's in early stages, so I don't have details on that.
Okay, no, that's fine. Okay, thank you. And just reiterating what Mr. Cooney said, thank you for your submission. It's very clear, and we're grateful for it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your time.
Which I think brings us to morning tea time. We're only a couple of minutes behind schedule. We do need to exit this call. I think Ms. Kelly will actually terminate it, so you'll all disappear from the screen, and you'll need to re-log in. I think this is right, Ms. Kelly, re-log in at 11:15 on the separate meeting request that relates to block 2 of the hearing. Are there any questions around that? Well, that being the case, thank you for contributions thus far, and we'll see you in about 11 minutes. Thank you all.